it's all right with you guys.
Yep.
Okay, and we'll actually start with Stephen, I think.
You bet.
Right, okay, good. So welcome everybody to our session on Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and other related settlement acts, including our guest from Canada, Grand Chief Peter Johnston. My name is Patuk Glenn. I'm on the Alaska Historical Society, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. So what we'll do, I think, is I'll go through and introduce our different speakers before they come up. And we're going to actually switch around the schedule a little bit while we wait for Paul Anderuk to come on the line. We'll start with Stephen Haycox. Every presenter will have 20 minutes to present. And I think, what do you think, Bill? Do we want to wait till questions for the end, or should we do short Q&A after the presentations?
That would be your decision.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll wait until the end for anybody to ask questions from all of our presenters. That way we make sure we have enough time and we get through all of the content. So I guess we'll have Stephen Haycox go first. I just want to let everybody know that he actually worked at the University of Alaska Anchorage for 40 years. And he taught history while he was there. And he's also won the Alaska Historical Society's Historian of the Year award twice. And he's going to give some background information about the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. I'll have him go ahead and provide more information.
Thank you, Patuk, and thanks everybody who's tuning in. I appreciate the interest. This is an essay I wrote for a festschrift that Frank Soos put together to honor Terence Cole. It was published early last year. I present it here because I'm not sure how many people may have seen it, and I've added some new details, some of which was prompted by a conversation I had with Will Schneider, and thank you, Will. It addresses a relationship between the Alaska Purchase and Alaska's modern native land claims history, of which I think not too many people are aware. The critical point is that there were no traditional Indian treaties with Alaska Natives. And because there were not, at the time of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971, much of Alaska land was potentially subject to native title, a circumstance very different from the history of native title in the contiguous states, and one that worked to the great advantage of Alaska Natives. Indian law is complex, often controversial. Grand Chief Peter, I taught for a year and a half at the University of Victoria, and I worked on BC land claims when I was there. And I discovered that they're every bit as complicated as Indian law in the United States. For example, the history of native sovereignty has generated significant legal debates. But there's a general consensus in the legal community on the points I want to make here. There are two central elements to understanding the relationship between the absence of treaties and the Claims Settlement Act here in Alaska. First, Aboriginal title. As defined by Interior Department Solicitor Felix Cohen, who was the New Deal Indian Commissioner John Collier's point man on Indian affairs, Aboriginal title is Indigenous title to any land that natives have ever utilized or occupied, whether or not they continue to utilize or occupy it. Oops. I just lost my connection.
We can still see you.
Oh, that's great. I can't see anything. Well, I'll continue.
You're not showing a PowerPoint, are you?
No, I'm not.
Okay, we can still see and hear you, so you're good.
Okay, super. I think I can rejoin here. Anyway, I'll just continue while I try to actually. All right, here we go.
Now we did lose him.
Oh, there he is.
Is he back?
Okay, now I'm back. Thank you. Now, potentially, that could be all of the land in the United States. But Congress, by a decision of the US Supreme Court in 1903, has absolute power over indigenous lands. It can extinguish native land title whenever it might choose to do so. Congress has extinguished Aboriginal title in virtually all of the land in the contiguous states, except that in reservations. It's done so by treaty. A treaty is an instrument for extinguishing native land claims, Aboriginal title. And it's the instrument that Congress used. Being highly conscious of property rights, the British and the Americans in the 17th and the 18th centuries recognized that the lands they coveted on the continent from the very beginning belonged to Indians. In the beginning, the British negotiated sales or other transfers of those lands when they didn't simply steal them by occupation and force sometimes resulting in massacre. But the new American government sought to provide a legal cover for their appropriation, their theft of native land, everywhere except, and that the device that they used were treaties. The treaties extinguished Aboriginal title, native land title, everywhere outside of the treaty box, outside the reservations. Inside the reservation, the land title was held in trust by the United States. So with that understanding, I can explain how Indian treaties and Aboriginal title relate to Alaska and native land claims. In 1871, 4 years after the Alaska Purchase, and before Congress addressed governance in Alaska, except for temporary military rule, Congress ceased making Indian treaties. There were no more after that date. The impetus for that decision came from the massacres of Indians on the Great Plains. Congress established an ad hoc body to investigate those massacres, called the Indian Peace Commission, in 1867. 2 years later, when that commission submitted its report, Congress engaged in a prolonged discussion about the commission's recommendations, one of which was to make no more Indian treaties. Congress acted on that recommendation in the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871. Subsequently, Congress would discuss and finally in 1887 formally implement a policy intended as an alternative to the extermination of Indians, which everybody thought was going to happen one way or another. That alternative was forced assimilation, articulated in the Dawes General Allotment Act, the Severalty Act, but that's a different subject for another paper. There's an additional element to consider. Will, I think you'll be particularly interested in this, in the evolution of Indian law in Alaska before moving to the Claims Settlement Act. In 1884, subsequent to the discovery of the Treadwell gold deposits in Southeast Alaska, Congress passed the first Organic Act for the territory, the Civil Government Act. Important to know here is that Congress did not extend public land laws to the United States to Alaska at the time of the purchase. Territory was unorganized, and Congress did not provide for its organization until the 1884 Act. In 1872, Congress had passed the Comprehensive Mining Act to govern the claiming and the development of mineral lands in Alaska. That law is still in effect today. But that act did not apply to the unorganized territory of Alaska. So there was, in fact, no legal mechanism for such mining developments as the Treadwell mines, no way to claim and record mining fines. Congress addressed that in the 1884 Civil Government Act. It provided in Section 8 of that act that the laws of the United States relating to mining claims were extended to the District of Alaska, but the extension was subject to the proviso that the Indians or other persons in said district shall not be disturbed in the possession of any lands actually in their use or occupation or now claimed by them. I want to emphasize the actually in their use and occupation. As written, this section of the Organic Act applies only to filing mining claims. Mining claims could not be filed on any land utilized, occupied, or claimed by natives, or, it's worth noting, other persons, Gussiks. The provision that Indians were not to be disturbed in the possession of any lands actually in their possession has been taken out of context and used to argue for a blanket congressional protection of native lands in Alaska, whatever those lands might be. That the congressional protection related only to the filing of mining claims in 1884 has been quite forgotten and is effectively moot today because of how the provision has been used. But a reading of the Act confirms its original, quite limited intention. Moving ahead then, essentially, though there were various court and executive actions during the first half of the 20th century, there was no finality on the issue. Perhaps the most important development of those years was the Tlingit-Haida Jurisdictional Act of 1935. After the cessation of treaty making, Congress on occasion passed acts authorizing courts to take jurisdiction over specific land claims. The Tlingit-Haida Act was one such, done by Congress. Then, in a wholly unprecedented action in 1941, in a case put together by Felix Cohen, the founder of modern Indian law, a case involving Arizona Indians and the Santa Fe Railroad, the US Supreme Court found in the United States v. Santa Fe Railroad for the validity of Aboriginal title. It was a landmark case establishing the fundamental grounding of indigenous land claims in the United States. The case is generally known as the Hualapai case for the Arizona Indians whose land was coveted by the railroad. As noted, in the contiguous states, virtually all such land title has been extinguished by treaty. But in Alaska, because there were no treaties and Congress had been laggard in addressing the issue of land title, potentially most of Alaska might be subject to native title, to Aboriginal title. That was the circumstance after the Hualapai ruling. In 1947, pursuant to the Jurisdictional Act, the Tlingit-Haida Central Council filed suit in what became the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, claiming ownership of all 18 million acres of the Alexander Archipelago. That case would be settled in court in 1959. The court found that, based on their concept of property ownership, the Tlingit and Haida Indians of Alaska had in fact owned all of the land in the Alexander Archipelago in 1867, nearly 18 million acres, that except for some specific small tracts, that was land that the Russians had never acquired title to. The United States had taken most of that land for the Tongass National Forest in 1905 and 1908. In this case, Aboriginal title was extinguished by the creation of the forest. Such takings by Congress do extinguish any existing Aboriginal title. The court's finding, though, that the Tlingit-Haida people had owned all of the Alexander Archipelago in 1867 shocked most Alaskans and was indeed seen as revolutionary in the broader context of indigenous claims in Alaska. In 1968, the court approved a compensatory award for having taken that land when it created the Tongass Forest. But what brought Alaska Native claims to a head was Alaska statehood. Though Congress had designated 54 million of Alaska's 375 million acres prior to 1958 in the forests in Mount McKinley National Park, it was, as it was then called, Katmai National Monument. The Alaska Statehood Act of 1958 initiated a 12-year saga that would see congressional disposal of all of the rest of Alaska's land except for 70 million acres. In Section 6 of the Statehood Act, Congress provided for the state to have title to 104 million acres of Alaska's 375 million acres, about 28%. But in Section 4 of that same act, Alaskans disclaimed any right or title to land that might be subject to native title. Congress put that in that act. Some people had tried to take it out, and the Alaska Native Brotherhood said, if you take it out, we're not going to approve a statehood act. And they had to put it back in. By the Hualapai doctrine of Aboriginal title, then, what land in Alaska might be subject to native title? Nearly all of it. Nearly all of it. In January 1959, officials of the state of Alaska began to select the land that Alaskans wanted. But within months, Alaskan natives began to protest some of what the state said it wanted. A chess match of selection and protest proceeded over the next 8 years, which resulted in the federal government transferring title of only about 12 million of the 104 million acres that the state was supposed to get title of, before the Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, stepped in and said, this is chaos. Nobody's going to invest in the development of Alaska economic resources under clouded title. And he implemented what became a freeze on any further conveyance of title of land to anybody, to the state of Alaska most particularly. As long as that freeze was in effect, there wasn't going to be any economic development of Alaska resources on land where the title was clouded. It's important to note here, by the way, that all this happened before the Prudhoe Bay discovery in 1968. This is all chaos before Prudhoe Bay. There would have had to have been a settlement of Alaska Native claims whether or not Prudhoe Bay was discovered. What Prudhoe Bay did was to turn a blowtorch on the process and hurry it up, if you will. But there would have had to have been a settlement eventually, or there would not have been economic development on any resources where the title was not clear. So the Claims Settlement Act was a direct outcome of the Statehood Act, but the foundation on which Native claims moved forward after statehood was laid was the absence of treaties and the Hualapai decision finding for the validity of Aboriginal title. What the claim settlement did then, of course, was provide 44 million acres of land for native title. And once the Conservation Act in 1980 was passed, where Congress reserved another 100+ million acres for new conservation units, then the state could go ahead and select the remaining acres of its 104 million acre entitlement. When that was all done, there were still 70 million acres left that Congress hasn't designated for the state or for natives, or is not in private property hold. 70 million acres, it's administered by the Bureau of Land Management. That's what they do. We should imagine then what Alaska would have looked like at statehood or in 1971, and in what circumstances Alaska Natives might have been had Congress not ceased treaty making coincident with the Alaska Purchase. There may well have been treaties with Alaska Natives, and if so, they would have established Indian reservations, Native reservations, or following the model of the Dawes Severalty Act, Natives would have been granted citizenship in return for severing whatever tribal relationship they might have had, and would have been given individual allotments. So the land would have been fragmented one way or another. and the challenge of gaining land title and the recognition and legitimacy in the eyes of the dominant culture which the claim settlement brought would have been far more difficult to achieve, if achievable at all. Would the Hualapai decision have had the same effect on Alaska if there had been treaties and allotments? No, because land title would already have been extinguished piecemeal over the years through the last part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And there would have been far few native challenges to the state's elections when the state began selecting under the Statehood Act in 1959. And Congress would have adjusted the treaty lands and would have bought out the allotments to make way for the pipeline. So the circumstances of Alaska Natives collectively would have been far less advantageous than they were in 1971 had there not been the absence of treaties and the Hualapai decision finding for the validity of Aboriginal title. It's a little bit complicated. I apologize for that, but it's really, really significant in understanding how Alaska Natives were able to move ahead in the 1960s toward a Claim Settlement Act, which came in 71. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And I want to compliment you for being under time. And if for those of you that just joined us, what we're going to do is we're going to run through the presentations, and everyone has 20 minutes. And after everyone presents, then we'll open it up for Q&A. So I think what we've got going on, we're still trying to get Paul on the phone. Is that right, Karen? Maybe Karen's.
This is Joe. Karen is working on it with Paul.
Okay. So with that, what we may do is go next to Grand Chief Peter Johnston. And just so everyone knows, he's from Canada. He's here to join us today to share with us a little bit about their efforts with land claims in the Yukon. And he is the son of Sam Johnston, who was one of the original land claims leaders from his region that went to Ottawa in the 70s to negotiate. So what I'll go ahead and do is I'll pass the mic to Grand Chief Peter Johnston.
Chish, Yaketsu Tarakoni, Chish Katuan, Taratini Hatuasal, Klingaganach, Yanadi Ayahat, Daslin Kwana Hat, Ahish Natlahash, Duasal Klingaganach. I just want to say good morning and thank everyone for the opportunity today to present from Yukon First Nation perspective. I am Peter Johnston. I'm a member of the Tesm Tlingit Council, which is a member, we are associated with the Tlingits from the coast. This is where our ancestors come from. My grandmother's people, my grandfather's people have all come from Southeast Alaska. So there's a very big connection to the Alaskan coast. And I feel very connected and honored to be here today to give a perspective that in my role as Grand Chief of the Council of Yukon First Nations is something that I cherish and it's a big honor for me to be leading this organization today, almost 50 years later from our, pretty well from Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. So we'll just ask Linda to start the slides and I'll begin the presentation. So Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow is a document that was brought forward to the Prime Minister of the day, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, in 1973 on February 14th. And the big joke of the day was that the chiefs were given the Prime Minister a Valentine's gift, and it was going to be about how we can not only help them out, but we can provide, a point for our people going forward when it comes to negotiating our rights and our interests, particularly here in the territories. So Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow is basically a statement of grievances. Go ahead. So if you look at our beautiful traditional territories here in the territory, it's very similar to the Alaskan coast. We have a lot of huge, pristine wilderness, let alone followed by big bodies of water, massive amounts of land, mountains, and an abundance of wildlife and resources that we take very seriously when it comes to not only preserving and doing it for the best interests of our future generations, but we live as part of the land, part of the water, and that has been our mantra for decades, and let alone since our ancestors have passed on this traditional knowledge to our people. Prior to contact, we lived a very organic life, if you will. There was no contact until the mid-1800s, and meanwhile, in the rest of Canada, you go back to 1492, let alone the 1500s to 1700s, there were a lot of treaties that were signed and implemented, if you will. Sorry?
We don't see your slideshow presentation, so who is ever doing your computer, I can show it if necessary, but if folks there can get that up.
Share screen? Share screen.
Also, Paul on and there we go. Okay, thanks.
You see me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we want full.
We'll get a full screen there. There you go. So anyways, when the rest of Canada was being impacted by first contact, if you will, there was a number of treaties that were signed between the royals, if you will, from England with the nations here in Canada. And just to give you a perspective, there's 634 nations across the country, 14 Yukon First Nations here. So we're very small when you look at them in a national context. There's over 56 different dialects, if you will, of language spoken in this country. But there was huge impacts that were not only being felt, like I said, from our brothers and sisters from the East, because of the impacts of colonialization happening at that point. However, I think just based on where we were located and where we are located and the ruggedness of our traditional territory, the frigid temperatures, getting into -60s, really kept people away, which was a good thing for us as First Nation people here in the territory. And it wasn't until later in our existence, if you will, through the middle 1800s, it was when people were starting to identify and starting to map out the areas that were known to us as First Nation people. But we had our own ways of doing and our own ways of being. We follow a clan society here with the Tlingit people. There's 3 different Tlingit nations, the Taku River Tlingit, Tesin Tlingit, and the Carcass and Tagish. We follow a moiety system where there's a level of clans. There's the 2 moieties, the Wolf and Crow, but then there's sub-clans as well, like underneath that sense of governance. So today, we're very fortunate. A number of the nations here have followed their traditional sense of governance. And then I'll get into that a little later in the presentation. But, we just had our own ways of being. Our connection to the land, our spirituality was very much intact. And it wasn't really, like I said, until the disruptions in the mid-1800s when not only the explorers were coming in, but equally important was the churches that were bringing a different sense of influence when it came to Christianity and how they viewed our connection to the land through spirituality. So it wasn't until the gold rush, and this is a very good shot of where we had upwards of 30 to 40,000 gold seekers coming particularly into the gold fields in Dawson City, which is the northern Yukon. We've seen pivotal changes that were happening to our people through just impacts that were night and day, if you will. So where I'm from, and traditionally, is in Teslin. We have a big water network that goes from my traditional territory all the way to Dawson City. So a lot of the gold seekers were utilizing the water bodies. The Chilkoot Trail, which is located around the Skagway area, was another main highway, if you will, of gold seekers that were coming in to seek fame and fortune, if you will. But really, at the end of the day, not a lot of gold was being extracted, and not a lot of people were finding success. But the impacts that the First Nations felt, particularly the Trondek people, were overwhelming. Not only were these people seeking out places to live and their own sense of economies, if you will, but the impacts that the people that lived in this land for thousands of years were being disrupted immediately. And on the left, there's the Han chief, chief of the Trondek, was Chief Isaac, and he moved his people from the settlement of Dawson, where they lived, because of the impact of, like I said, 30 to 40,000 people moving into this traditional territory pretty well overnight. He felt that if he did not move his people out of the way, if you will, and immobilize them to a different place, they were going to be affected greatly. And very similar to the chief on the right side of the picture, Tom Chief Jim Boss, the same effects were being felt because the gold seekers are going through his traditional territory, seeking fame and fortune in Dawson, but leaving the impact, killing the wildlife, you know, just this whole impact of not understanding the land. Our people were feeling very much the necessary effects of the gold rush, which, like I said, the impacts were very short, but the impacts we're still feeling very much today in our traditional territories. However, at the same time, as much as we were being very traditional, we were starting to see impacts of, like I said, not only of a different way of society, if you will, but let alone the churches were very much influenced in the way we dealt with things. Being very communal, and as I mentioned earlier in the discussions, we very much were people that came together to not only celebrate our abundances through traditional language and dances and practices, but we were very much, you know, influenced and I think a lot of cases absorbed that influence because of the fact that we were, you know, just the way we were being resonated, I think, through the church systems in particular, we're seen as being very poor, if you will. So the influence of creating this whole different way of doing, let alone the way we practiced our spirituality, you know, was very starting to see the, you know, the dissemination of our people and the way we were connected to the land, and starting to seeing the uprooted connection to that, very much that kept us in tune, because we lived by the seasons, we died by the seasons, if you will, and if we weren't prepared, traditionally, we very much suffered by that. So the point that we lived in communal situations was to create that dependence on one another, and which very much today we feel that same thing, that we need these connections to one another in order to help support one another and to move, if you will, like I said, from season to season, from fish camp to beaver camp to moose camp, and how we, you know, had our own economies, if you will, was what connected us to one another. But once we started to see the developments, like I said, through the church, through the gold rush, we were starting to see major influences, especially with the building of the Alaska Highway in with the finish and completion, obviously, in 41, and then with you know, with the threats of war in 42. You know, we're starting to see pivotal changes, and particularly in southeast Alaska, or in the Yukon, I should say, was pretty well overnight. Like the same thing was with the push of 8 months to build this connection, if you will, from the south to Alaska, and the threat of, you know, many different things from the Japanese. We were very much impacted once again, and without any consultation, I think we're used and abused, I think, for our knowledge of the land. Our people were utilized to guide the military through treacherous amounts of territory, like I said, through swamps and some of the harshest conditions in the territory. But our people were utilized, like I said, to be not only navigators, but also to help, you know, make the U.S. military feel at home. But the impacts at that point in time were bringing sickness. And when you have 4,000, 5,000 men come into your community, it affects the women in our community at the same time. So, and I know in my nation, in Teslin, there was detrimental effects of just having this influence, let alone this influx of particularly men in our community, really pushed our traditional way of life, but created this whole new reality when it came to having that connection now through roads. So, however, still through the 40s and 50s, we're very much still traditional people. We utilized, you know, the dog team and the pack dogs, if you will, let alone the waterways to navigate. And it wasn't nothing for us to walk for 3 to 5 days just to get to a place, not only to meet with other people, but to, you know, especially when the residential school era came into effect, you know, our people were now being forced to go into, you know, conventional ways of learning, and that was through the residential school. And you know, it wasn't nothing for our people to go, like I said, to walk 3 days to take our kids to school. And you can start seeing now the influence, especially with this slide, how our people were starting to change, and the way, you know, when you start to look, and I appreciate the presentation earlier about the American Indians, and just the perspective that the settlers had on us, and that we did not look, let alone smelt proper. You know, we looked poor, we were dirty, we were, if we're going to be a part of society, we need to change the way we not only look, but how we presented ourselves. So the school, through the residential school system, was really trying to take the Indian out of the child, if you will. And they done a very well, you know, they were very successful to a certain degree, because it does, you know, as we're still dealing with people that are third, fourth generation here in the territory that are still struggling, and a lot of people that are being impacted that are struggling with addiction problems or are still a burden on society, if you will, through the eyes of government. A lot of this has to do with that dysfunction and the uproots of our traditional ways, and really forcing a modernization approach to how we're going to deal with the Indian problem. And I could talk about this really a lot from a more extensive process and how it affected us as Canada. But I come back to the Yukon because we're very different. And even though we're very much connected to our Alaskan brother and sisters, we're very much different in how we developed, if you will. And I think when you think about the comparisons, I look at the Alaska case, let alone the Yukon case, and I'm very fortunate to say that, you know, we're very fortunate to be where we are today, based on not only the leadership, let alone the vision. So when we came to looking at how, you know, our people were very visual, and we could start to see the detrimental effects through, like I said, the gold rush, through the Build in Alaska Highway, the influence of the church, the influence of government policy that is now starting to take away our rights and our identities. You can see the influx of non-First Nation people now moving into the territory that are starting up businesses. Here in the territory, we weren't even allowed to vote, let alone get a job, until the 60s, right? So with the enfranchisement acts that were instilled in the 1850s through government, you know, our women had lost their rights, which was a way of alleviating government responsibility to future generations. And it wasn't until Bill C-31 in 1985 that finally gave back the rights back to our women. Women were now viewed as being First Nations once again, but the detrimental effect of that enfranchisement act had left a couple generations now of people without an identity, let alone a First Nation identity at this time. So our people started to gather in the mid-60s to start talking about what are we going to do, not only to preserve and continue this way of life, but more importantly, what is it going to look like for us as future generations? And the Prime Minister, along with the Indian Minister, Jean Chrétien, the Indian Affairs Minister, developed a white paper. And this was pretty well their last-ditch effort to enfranchise the First Nations here in the territory. They felt that if First Nations are going to have any success or prosperity in this world, let alone in their traditional territories, they need to be more like the modern people. They need to understand that, you know, we're going to move you into municipalities. We're going to start forming these different ways of ways to govern yourself. However, you do need to give up your Indian status and your Indian rights, because if you're going to be more like the modern places, you need to start looking and acting like that. So a lot of our elders and our leaders of the time felt very concerned. They started to, like I said, to gather and start to discuss what it could look like, because they're starting to see examples in other parts of the country where, particularly the James Bay Cree, were very much impacted by development, that in order for us, if we do not start talking about what it means for us as Yukon First Nations, we could get caught up in this momentum and lose our rights altogether. So it wasn't, like I said, that triggered this was the 1969 white paper. So our people there was a national movement happening at the same time across the country. We established a Yukon chapter called the Yukon Native Brotherhood, which was led by a group of individuals, including our leader, Elijah Smith, who was very instrumental of not only forming and starting to gather and bring insight together through our elders and our vision of what we wanted. But more importantly, he had very good connections to Ottawa, which I think at the end of the day was a lot of, it alleviated a lot of that stress, the unknown of what the First Nations in the territory wanted. We had educated non-First Nations people promoting for us in Ottawa the right way to do things here in the territory would not only alleviate, like I said, lawsuits and this division, if you will, but it may help bring the territory together for future developments and future prosperity. So with all the work that was undertaken, many hours, many years of developing this, it wasn't, like I said, until 1973, February 14th, a group of 12 chiefs led by our leader, Elijah Smith, who's on the far right there. They brought the document to the Prime Minister of the time, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And like I said, it was a statement of grievances. It was not only talking about how we've been affected, but here are some solutions going forward and how we feel and we deem that our people will not only find prosperity, but they'll be able to also maintain their way, their traditional ways of life, their language, even in this midst of where we see so much dysfunction happening in our communities with alcoholism and just dysfunction through all the physical and abuse that we've, struggled and suffered with over almost like, close to 100 years by this point. We felt that we do have a vision going forward, and that's together today for our children tomorrow. It did have some dynamics to that at the same time, because based on that government policy, like I said, the Enfranchisement Act, which took the rights of women away, we already had this second-class citizens, if you will, within our own traditional territories that visioned, we had non-status and we had the status rights of the status Indians that were still intact, but then we also had women's rights that were not being reflected, like I said, very similar to many movements across the countries. It wasn't until 1918 that women were allowed to vote in Canada, but yet the First Nations women were still being once again segregated and didn't have the same rights and privileges. So it wasn't until 1980 that we formed the Council of Yukon Indians, which really brought the momentum together, not only as a collective here in the territory, but more importantly, that we had joined together, and I feel the forces had brought us all together to create this super group, if you will, of individuals. We had many great leaders from many different aspects, let alone we started to organize and start to support our people to go out and start to get the education that we need, especially when it comes to legal support. We really created this whole movement going forward, which lasted, when they delivered the paper, they felt it was going to be 6 months to reach a deal when it comes to land claim. But we ended up being 25 years of long, hard struggle, which I really felt at certain times in our life. In the course of that history, like in 1984, we were kind of in this place of negotiation once again, where we were offered over $600 million, but we had to give up our Indian rights. Definitely came back with rejection, and we came back to the table. And then 10 years later, we actually ended up having a better deal, which formed, like I said, Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, but it created this umbrella final agreement, which we stand upon today. And like I said, and that slide was a very good example of how the connections that we made with not only with Ottawa, but with the highest rank when it comes to the Prime Minister really, I think, alleviated like a lot of the concern that Ottawa had, what the Indians wanted in the Yukon. But equally as important that we had this platform now that we can negotiate and start moving forward. And if you look at our agreements here in the Yukon, it's easy to say that we have maybe the best agreements in the country, let alone in the world, when it comes to how we not only navigate through our traditional territories. As you can see the traditional territory map, the Yukon is all Indian country if you look at it, and it always has been. And today with our agreements, it really solidifies not only our jurisdiction when it comes to making law or the economic opportunities. We now have so many opportunities now that we can't even fathom where we're going to be in our future. We have, our umbrella final agreement is protected by the Canadian Constitution, which gives us that traditional right, let alone it's recognized by our country, if you will. When you look at our settlement lands, it's not a lot of land. When you look at the Yukon in general, it's 16,000 square miles. But when you go back to that traditional territory map, we have definitely influence of the whole territory. Even some of these subsurface rights below the ground, we already have 10,000 square miles, which is another, when it comes to mining and development, we have different rights that have been identified and included, which, like I said, is something that we have to really be thankful for, because at the end of the day, when it comes to development, and even in a modern sense, you know, we have every ability now to have an influence at the tables that they're negotiating, but the benefits that come from those. So the final compensation, like I said, at the end of the day, was $242 million in 1989 dollars, which we refer to now as compensation dollars. So we're now allowed to invest in companies. So in particularly my First Nation, you know, we own Coca-Cola franchises in Canada here now. We own wineries in British Columbia. You know, we're investors in hotels and airlines in order to build that prosperity, so we don't have to depend so much on federal transfers from government. We now have an opportunity to create individual wealth for the nations, which we're starting to see the benefits now over the last 25 years. So within those self-government agreements, it allows us the control of education for our children. We still live a traditional lifestyle when it comes to hunting and harvesting. Equally as important is that we have these opportunities to co-govern within the territory, which we have Canada, Yukon, and Yukon First Nations being partners in these agreements. We have the non-extinguishment of Aboriginal rights and titles, so they can never strip us of this rights to hunt and fish throughout the years and live our traditional lives. We're represented fully on a number of boards, such as the Heritage and Resource Management Boards, Fish and Wildlife Management Board, Economic Development Boards. We all have equal participation in these. And we're starting to see the effects now, because we have now a generation of our citizens that have grown up in a self-government reality. They don't even know what the Indian Act is, which is something that obviously came in the 1870s and has been detrimental to our ways in doing. And today, you know, there's still over 600 nations in Canada that are still under this racist form of governance that provides, you know, lifestyle for these nations across our country. So here in the territory, like I said, we're very fortunate. Not to say that we don't have our struggles when it comes to government relations, but the more that we can come together with solution-based, you know, discussions and have that opportunity to be in the same room when it comes to decision making. When we move into the future, when our capacities are built with educated First Nation communities and let alone members, we're going to have prosperity going into the future for many generations to come. So last but not least, these are the foundations that we stand upon today. Unfortunately, out of the 14 nations, there's only 11 that have settled. There's still 3 that choose to be outside of self-government reality and still choose to be under the Indian Act, and we still honor and respect their decisions. But at the end of the day, you know, it's important to understand that we are living in a different world now compared to those Indian Act First Nations. I do not like the word treaty though myself. We are never given a coin from the Queen. And today we have agreements that are modern agreements with governments. So I know I'm at about 23 minutes, and I apologize, Patuk, because I'm starting to use the previous guy's time. So
My apologies to interrupt you.
no problem.
We're running out of time. So what we'll do, for those of you that may have joined us, thank you so much for your presentation. But for those of you that may have just joined us, we're giving each presenter 20 minutes to speak. And then at the end of every presentation, then we'll have time for question and answer. And when you can also, on the Q&A box, you can enter a question for text to be read out, or at the end of the presentations, you can use the raise your hand function, and Karen will give you the unmute privileges. So with that, I think our next presenter is Paul Anderuk. He's got a bachelor's degree in religion and philosophy, and he's got a graduate degree in education. He's from the Northwest region of Alaska, and he's an Inuk, or part of the Inuit Nation. So I'll go ahead and pass the reins on to him, and he can share with you what he's going to present about.
Hi, thank you so much. And I'd like to apologize for coming in so late and out of sequence. And I appreciate the other presenters and you working so well around that little hiccup on the technology, most probably on my side. But Again, I came in a little bit late. I'm going to try and just mention a couple of things connecting to this, to the prior presentation, which is a wonderful context, social historical context for the Yukon. I always appreciate finding out more about Indigenous political status and negotiations and addressing these just ongoing issues for us as peoples. So again, I'm an Inupiat. I'm from Northwest Alaska. From the Nome region is where our family is. Little Diomede, Wales, Teller, and Nome. Little bits from other places, but that's our general area. I'm at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and let's see. I'm also holding my phone, so I'm trying to make sure that I'm somewhere in the focus. I hope this works.
Paul, if it's easier for you to just do audio, we could do that. Is that easier for you?
Yes. Why don't we try and do that?
Or just
And we'll
take yourself
see
off.
how that.
Okay.
Okay. Let me see if I can do that part.
Okay. Yep. Now
There we
just
go.
still picture. Let's just do that.
All right. Very good. So see if I can transition. I'm trying to out my notes from in length. Here's I know this may seem odd, but just hang in there with me. One of the things that that was brought up is this note that we're always dirty, and the descriptions of so many people who are coming up to our regions, and I do have a small explanation I think that might help, because the initial travelers often came up during the summers. They're following their boats. So in our region, Northwest Alaska, beginning in 1848, it was Yankee whalers, commercial whalers who came into our waters and had the greatest initial impact. And not long and not far behind them are government officials and missionaries. Missionaries being quasi-government officials and sometimes explicitly a part of the governing structures that are introduced. And in their journals and in their work, they often are describing us as dirty. And I always thought, well, you know, it's not something that I see so much traditionally. But then on one trip going upriver with my dad, we just ran out of mosquito repellent. We stayed too long. I hadn't packed enough. That was my job, and I failed in that. And we're sort of stuck. And you know, you don't want to not continue fishing when things are going really well. So we actually went traditional pre-DEET in our dealing with the mosquitoes. And for us in our area, the way to do that was we took some of the seal oil we had, and you mixed it with ash from the fire. And when you do that as a mix, and you use that as kind of, think of it as like a facial cream is the best way that I can describe it. And you're putting it anywhere where you want. You have to have your skin exposed, and so you have this mix of a coating of seal oil with ash, and it turns out it's a great mosquito repellent. The mosquitoes just can't bite you through it, and it was kind of an eye-opener for me, because I thought, oh, this is why we're dirty, and all those descriptions by the missionaries and miners and whatnot in their journals and reports. And it fit nicely, of course, within their general picture of dirty and savages. But if they were not having mosquito nets and other things, this might account for a part of that, why that description was there. I just had to put that one out there as a part of the conceptual confusions that were occurring between people. My paper presentation centered on, I think, an activity or a perspective that over the decades has continually surprised people who are new to the issues of dealing with indigenous tribes and our relationship to these settler nations. And I think just having talked with a couple of former students yesterday evening about this, they were bringing up, well, what surprised them the most about some of the discussions that came up in classes. And these are from some time ago. And it dovetailed with the point that I made in the proposal for Bill Schneider when I was asked to consider being on this panel, which was such a treat, a privilege. And that is that they did not understand how much our negotiations with and our dealing with the settler nations is an away game. It's not a home game for us. It's physically about our homelands and waters. But from a legal and political standpoint, our negotiations always occur on their terms and on their preconditions. And the preconditions for getting to the table in order to begin negotiations are typically shaped around, one, the realities on the grounds, and that is a power factor. And there is an irresistible military power that you're dealing with. And they often impact our communities and regions first in dramatic ways. They occupy key resource areas. They typically are occupying areas that are of tremendous importance, particularly from a trade standpoint, because often those intersecting areas of rivers and lakes that contact with the coastal areas in Northwest Alaska, those areas that are best for our trading meetings are often our annual trade fairs. Those were also prime locations for the missionaries and government officials. And it worked that way because they were coming up in the summer. And so as they were coming up in the summer, within our cycle of life, within doing, being at different places to be at the right place at the right time with the right knowledge and the right disposition and the right strategies and equipment for taking advantage of these temporary blooms of abundance that occur in those locations, that they would find us in areas that in the summertime were ideal for, in our case, for example, sealing sites. And if you're at an ideal location for sealing, when these government officials were taking the revenue cutters up the coast of Alaska and bringing missionaries with them, they're looking for us. They're looking for our population. And when they would find a large population, they would unload these sort of prefabbed schools / parsonages / teacher residence, church classroom structures. And they were pre-built in Seattle or Oregon, and then loaded onto these revenue cutters, and they would bring them up. And they find a population of us, they unload their equipment and have these prefabs installed, and that becomes the year-round residence. And in many cases, these are some of the worst possible places to locate a year-round residence, because it's not where you would want to be during the more demanding time of the year, which would be the winter time. And for us, Northwest Alaska, the community of Kivalina is an ideal example of this, or not ideal in the sense of it came out best, but as the most typical. So they see us there, and we unload, and we're there, and that becomes a year-round residence, but it's a sandbar. And it's an ideal place for the winds that are coming offshore for drying food, for drying meat. And it's an ideal place because of it being a great location for sealing. But actually the wintertime residence is further back at the mouth of a river within the tree line, which is out of the winds. And that's a much better location for having a more permanent structure. If you're going to pick one, that's the area you would want to be. But because the permanent structure is set up at our summer camp, the spring, summer sealing camp, we end up with the current conditions where there's a water shortage, there's flooding, the winds are just terrific in the permanent location. And then people are saying, well, why did you ever start the community there? And the answer is, this wasn't our decision. This was the history of how the occupation happens. And I think it represents the way to understand this whole process of land claims negotiations and tribal recognition, and the whole structure of why it doesn't come out the way people seem to think it often is portrayed. Because often there's the sense, and I'm talking about for people who are new to these issues of land claims and negotiations between indigenous groups and settler nations, there was a sense in which it's equal partners meeting at a table, and we're having an exchange among equals, and we come up with, this, whatever the settlement is. And then the follow on is, well, then why are you complaining about this generous offer that we've provided you? And it really helps for them to understand the conditions were already shaped before the negotiations occur. So in Nome, while the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act finally settles as legislation in 1971, the gold rush was happening in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Alaska. So the land rush, this influx of tens of thousands of outsiders who are coming into the area, that's happened already. And from the 1850s on, 1948 on, there's already long-term deep impacts from missionary work and from the commercial interests, decimating 90% of the whale population and a huge part of the walrus population that have these dramatic impacts before the negotiations are really occurring in the 1960s, culminating in this official document in 18 December 1971 with ANCSA. So it's the opposite of what you would think of a normal transaction. If somebody were buying say a 1964 and a half Mustang, and it's pretty much original, pristine condition. It was parked in a garage and pretty much rarely used. You would think, well, of course, but what if the person who wants to buy the vehicle has been driving it for 20 years and now they want to purchase it from you, and the basis of the purchase is that you're going to sit at my house, and I'm going to not only be the person who's negotiating, but you're doing it in my location. It's an away game. And I already have practical possession of much of what I want. And I'm describing to you what the conditions are of that vehicle. I'm laying out what I think is the right price for this. And what I'm going to be basing the price on is not even the value of the vehicle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to base it on what I think your social and economic needs are. So it's not the value of the vehicle, it's my making a judgment as to how much money you need as a result of this exchange. It has nothing to do with fair market value at all. That's the one principle that we will operate on from the outset, that it is not going to be based on fair market value. And although for people who are politically deeply involved in the politics of Indigenous land issues and government relations with the federal and provincial or state governments, this kind of framework is just understood. It's often a surprise to even begin to grapple with that. And the circumstance is that while we might be on the Indigenous side, this might be understood, and it's understood by leadership who are with us often for decades. On the other side of the table, there's a lobotomy that occurs on the political and legal side. About every 5 years, it appears. There's just turnover on the other side politically. And when they come into it, they're not really thinking about all of this context that we've just described. And so there's a learning curve if there's any interest in really learning anything about that context. And that makes it an additional challenge for Indigenous politics to help make this something that will be more equitable and will make it more reasonable for thinking about where we are now and where we should be as nations going forward. These set of circumstances and these realities. It also helps the next generation of Indigenous people leadership as they are taking on these tasks, because I know there's a part of it in which, in this ongoing, is that there's a sense by the younger generation that the older generation of Indigenous people simply sold out, because obviously they did not achieve the kind of equitable claims that from a legal and social standpoint would have been quite different than the negotiated settlements that they are dealing with today. And it's difficult for the newer generation of leadership to understand this immensely difficult set of circumstances that are framed in just the small ways that I've tried to describe in the few minutes that we have. And I think that's a part of what we're doing. On the side of the older generation, a part of the gap is that we recognize that, for example, with ANCSA, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, the feds initially are talking about anywhere from 2 to 10 million acres, 10 million being a phenomenally generous settlement in terms of the land part of the agreement. And the monetary settlement at close to $1 billion is by far the largest Indigenous settlement in world history, but you're grading on a pretty low curve of what the prior settlements were. And although it's a remarkable accomplishment, it's easy to oversell what an accomplishment it was, because it's almost miraculous to have achieved the kind of settlement that was achieved in 18 December 1971, considering that the competing interests of the state of Alaska, the federal government, the oil corporations, and the conservation at the table. And of all those groups, it's the Alaska Native peoples who have the least resources in terms of financial underpinning in order to compete and shaping the legislation
Paul,
that results.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're running out of time. Did we lose him? I think we, oh no, Paul, there, okay, there you are. Paul, I hate to just cut you off like that. That's the hardest job about being a moderator.
Oh, no, I appreciate it.
Very interesting, and maybe if we have a little bit more time at the end, you could speak a little bit more on that, or someone, depending on what questions they ask. But I actually, I wanted to turn it over to our last presenter, just in case anybody ends up being short for time today. Our last presenter is William Schneider. He's actually our Alaska Historical Society board president, and he's retired from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and he did a lot of work with oral history and Project Jukebox while he was there. I'll let him add to that if he would like to, and I'll let him get started on his presentation. And so we'll give you 20 minutes, and then at the end of that 20 minutes, we'll do Q&A. Again, if you want to ask a question, there's a box down at the bottom for Q&A for Karen to read out, or you can put your hand up and she can unmute you to ask your question. Okay, without further ado.
Yeah, Karen, can you pull it to full screen?
I did. You guys can't see it?
It's not at full screen.
It is on my end.
What do I?
I think you have to do play or slideshow, click on slideshow or view, maybe it's view. If you click on view and maybe it'll give you the option to play it.
Yeah, I did that. Is that better?
No, you'll have to click on the individual slides.
Yeah,
So
but
maybe
you can't see it?
we see the entire program, but we don't see the full screen.
That's weird.
So just click on the icons as we go through.
You might be able to.
Because I'm seeing full screen on mine.
I don't know how to do this.
Click to the next slide and click over on that side and click to the next slide.
But I'm showing it, not Bill. If you want to do screen share, then I'll stop my share. And now you open it on your computer.
That means you go to your.
Okay, now we're set. Okay. All right.
So you have to do
I'll
screen-
run it. Yeah, thank you. So December 18th, 1971, as we know, President
Share
Nixon.
your screen.
We're not seeing the slides. I think you need to do screen share or share screen.
Yep. Just click on share screen.
So what you did, Bill, I think is you just opened your thing here and you got yourself out of the
Zoom.
Zoom.
Can you hear me?
Let me try mine again.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Oh, there we go.
You're seeing mine?
Yep, I'm seeing President Richard Nixon.
Okay, Bill, just start talking.
All right.
President Nixon is on.
All right. That's fine. All right. So December 18th, 1971, President Nixon signed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, what we know as ANCSA. This was precipitated by years of concern within the Native community about developments by the new state, as well as the recent discoveries of oil. But now, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of ANCSA, it's important for us to ask what took place. How do we take stock of this? In particular, I want to talk about the treatment of land and subsistence resources and how they were handled. So going to the next screen, we know that after President Eisenhower signed the Statehood Act in 1959, the state and the federal government initiated development plans and land selections. And these had impacts on the Native communities. I'm going to show a number of well-worn examples of this, and I'll move very quickly through it. The first is Project Chariot in Northwest Alaska, the plan to detonate an atomic explosion to create a harbor. The next one was the Rampart Dam in interior Alaska on the Yukon River, which would have flooded the Yukon Flats and the villages contained within there in order to produce hydroelectric power. The third is the Minto Flats Road and Recreation Area that was proposed leading into the area that is important to the village of Minto and their subsistence activities. Oil at Prudhoe Bay was the impetus for the state and federal government to finally settle Native land claims. They needed unfettered access to build a pipeline from the North Slope to Tidewater at Valdez. Settling land claims would clear the way and would avoid litigation so they could build the pipeline. But the subsistence issues which had dominated the discussions leading up to land claims were largely ignored in the legal treatment of land claims. In fact, they were extinguished. The extinguishment of Aboriginal title and Aboriginal land hunting and fishing rights, Section 4B of the Act was a major blow to native subsistence. Instead, what we got was a corporate solution. Native lands would be owned by corporations, not tribes. Tribal rights to game management would revert to the state and the federal government. Regional and village corporations were established, and these were the legal entities, and these were held in fee simple title, which meant that tribal claims to land subsistence no longer would be present. Now this, the reasoning behind this was based in part on the common use provisions of the state constitution, which meant that there would be no native priority on subsistence on native corporate lands outside of federal lands. That is, that state law, state fish and game laws would hold sway, not any tribal laws or tribal rights that may have existed before. The implications of ANCSA on native subsistence were immense. The state was free now to proceed with development since there was no tribal claim remaining. Natives on the land were subject to state game laws, as I just mentioned. Then this whole picture became even more complicated 9 years later in 1980 with the establishment of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. In this act, special provisions were made for rural subsistence users based upon customary and traditional use, local residency, and the availability of alternate resources. The key point here is local residence. This, as you might imagine, was in direct conflict with the state's mandate to not give priority to any particular group of people or region. So at this point, really, the table was set. The table was set for the federal government to create rural subsistence priority on federal land, for the state to be bound by its common use provisions, and in that way to comply with its law. And the Alaska was left with a dual management system on federal and state land. This leaves us with three key questions, and I'll only answer two of them in the remaining time that I have. The first is, what are the interests of the participants who created ANCSA? The first president of the Alaska Federation of Natives was Emil Noddy, and when addressing Congress with the AFN bill, he made the point that natives depend upon the land for subsistence, and that preserving this way of life is important to them while they still want to live that way of life. It was important to hold enough land to protect subsistence resources, and land not selected by natives needed to have some sort of prioritized situation for rural residents in times of resource shortage. So he played a very key role. The next figure is Willie Hensley. As you know, Willie Hensley in 1966 wrote an essay for a college class at the University of Alaska. And in there, that was a clarion call for land claims, a call to finally settle what natives deserved in his mind. But he also went on to head the task force, the governor's task force on native land claims. And on that task force, he said that the native uses and occupancy of lands should be recognized and maybe continued. Another key figure was Esther Wenneke, who worked for the Federal Field Committee for Developmental Planning in Alaska, and they were charged with coming up with a basic survey of Alaska, the condition of Alaska natives at the time before land claims, at the point of land claims, and to make recommendations. And as I think all of you may know, they produced that giant volume, Alaska Natives in the Land. It must be the heaviest book in the library. But one of the findings that they had, that they came up with, was that if natives just were dependent upon the surface title to protect subsistence, they would need 60 million acres. You can imagine this sent a shudder down the backs of legislators. Other means of protecting native subsistence beyond what could be granted in land claims had to be found. Esther Wenneke, in her report on the different positions, stated the following: the field committee calls for emergency closure of areas threatened by depleted subsistence resources. The Department of the Interior claims that land granted to villages should be sufficient in times of resource shortage. AFN called for subsistence priority and use on public and state lands. And the state, as you might imagine, because of the common use provision, could not accept a priority use by Alaska natives. Now, the head of the Federal Field Committee was a man by the name of Joseph Fitzgerald, and he came out with an even stronger statement in his testimony to Congress. He said that the Federal Field Committee recommendations include a provision for the Secretary of the Interior to classify lands surrounding villages so as to make their use for subsistence, fish, and wildlife production a priority area among competing uses. So that was a very, very strong statement by him.
Bill, I'm moving the slide, so just keep going.
Okay, would you go to the next slide?
You're on Keith Miller, and hopefully
Yeah.
everyone's seeing them.
Keith Miller, who was at that time governor, reiterated the state's position. And you can all see his slide. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, good. And then let's go to the federal position here. If we go to the next slide of President Nixon. Wally Hickel, in his capacity as Secretary of the Interior at the time of land claims, made the following statement. Basically, our position has been that there is not a legal claim, and that if there is not a legal claim, there at least is a moral claim. It was never really faced up to, even in the Statehood Act. And I think that's really an important point because, as Steve Haycox and others have pointed out, Greening and Bartlett were even reluctant to have land claims mentioned in the Statehood Act. So I think there was a general attitude at that time that statehood, that native land claims was a federal responsibility, not something that the state needed to deal with. Now, could we go to the slide of Bobby Kilburg? Bobby Kilburg was a young woman who worked in the Nixon White House, and she's been interviewed several times by the Nixon and Ford archives, and provides an insight into President Nixon and his views. in the development of what Nixon began to call his Indian policy, a change from assimilation to self-determination. And there were two primary land issues that he was involved with. One was the return of Blue Lake to the Taos Pueblo people, and the second was the Alaska Native land claims. One of the insightful points that she makes in an interview is a case when Ehrlichman came out of the president's office and announced that the president was willing to accept a 40 million acre settlement of land. And everyone thought that that's what the president was saying. Later in the day, Bobby, knowing Ehrlichman, went up to him and said, is that really the case? Did he really say that? And she reports that he just kind of smiled and winked at her. So we really don't know if that was the president or whether it was Ehrlichman that provided that level of support. And if we could go to the next slide, which is of Don Wright. Don Wright met with President Nixon and reported that the president regards ANCSA as part of Indian policy implementation. The president said he would veto any bill that did not provide enough land to meet the native needs. And now the slide of Scoop Jackson. Interestingly, a week before the signing of land claims, Senator Jackson introduced Senate Concurrent Resolution number 26. This was a formal recognition of the relationship of natives with the federal government. It repudiated Resolution 108, which was in support of termination. So Congress was coming on board with the president's position. Now I want to turn finally in this history section to Senator Stevens. 25 years after land claims, in an interview with Red Boucher, he's reported as saying, "Let me tell you, Red, I started studying this when I was in the Interior Department, and I was legislative counsel and solicitor, and I worked at it in the 50s. I've been involved in trying to solve the native land claims and the native problem in the state for a long time, and it's a sincere desire on their part to have this problem solved. But one of the things that people now believe is that it was a mistake to have the settlement of 71. It was that act that gave people the ability to learn something about the areas and everything else. It was the most unique act in the history of the Congress. We settled 200 claims, separate, different claims that could have been presented against the government by a piece of legislation, instead of having those people having to go through court and pay lawyers. Looking at the Teotihuacan case in Southeast Alaska, it took over 20 years to settle that case, and it cost them a lot of money. Now I think that we need to work together as Alaskans. And I find a great deal of sympathy for that in the Native community. But the failure of the Congress and the legislature to face up to the subsistence issue is forcing people who are otherwise reasonable about Native, non-Native relationships in this state to move over into those people who are unreasonable about Native, non-Native relationships. We've got to solve the subsistence issue. Now, what is so amazing about this statement by Senator Stevens is that he looks at the extinguishment of Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights, the necessary preconditions, as a good thing. And yet, at the end, he sees it as, in my eyes, as the irritant that hasn't been resolved. And so that was Senator Stevens' position. Now, I want to go to the next slide and look at two different periods of history. If we look at the 1950s period, 1955, 56, at the Constitutional Convention, few people at that convention were familiar with rural Alaska. The consultant who wrote the natural resource provision, Ostrom, was from the outside. There was little understanding of native subsistence and little interest because it was considered a federal government position, the problem, that is. Now, in 1980, ANILCA was, Title VIII, that is, of ANILCA, was based on the premise that something had to be done to deal with the subsistence issue, which had not been adequately addressed in ANCSA. And so we have two different periods of history, two different understandings of the historical context. And it's critical that we keep those in mind. Now, the next slide raises certain ethical questions in times of resource shortage. Should there be priority access versus equal access? More for some versus less for all? Limited by need versus limit everyone? Do all Alaskans value rural subsistence over equal access for everyone in times of resource shortage? And we'll go to the next slide. And it leads us to choices: equal access or limited total take for everyone. Priority access, limit access to rural Alaskans. No action, resources could be over-harvested. And the final, I think we have a final slide. We've got a predicament. And the predicament is dual management based on different values and mandates has led to conflict over access to subsistence resources. To choose, it's a bit like Jean-Paul Sartre said, to choose not to choose is basically to make a decision. And the decision we've made is to create this conflict, and we haven't worked our way out of it. I was going to give you a solution, but I think time has run out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your presentation, very interesting. And so now we've got a little bit of time for questions and answers. Excuse me. If you want to ask a question, use the feature to put your hand up. Otherwise, you can put your question in the Q&A box and Karen will read them out.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, which I've lost. Okay. So I'll start with that and go back and forth with some hand raising also. So the first question is from David Ramser to Chief Johnston. And all of you panelists can see the questions in the Q&A if you click on the little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Some of these are somewhat long questions, so I will try to read them slowly. So the question to Chief Johnston is, was any compensation provided to your tribal members for the adverse effects of Alcan construction in the 1940s? And you are on mute at the moment, Chief, so you have to unmute.
Unfortunately, no, there was no compensation added. There was just detrimental effects. I know there was agreement between the Canadian government and the Alaskan government about who was going to maintain the highway, but that's about all the benefits we got, was just the maintenance of the Alaska Highway. So we're still dealing with a lot of the detrimental effects because pretty well every 20 miles there was a major camp, and the devastation that they left on the land has now created this whole, our people are suffering from cancer because of all the contaminants that the military left in the ground and pretty well buried they have so many dumps along the highway that they've left their waste and Agent Orange, all these chemicals that they were using to kill the foliage along the highway, all affected our people, and we're still living with those effects today. So no compensation.
Okay, there is another question about to you, Chief, about can you talk some about how your fisheries have changed over the years? Subsistence and commercial, if you have commercial fisheries, but how your fisheries have changed.
Well, unfortunately, we're very bleak in regards to our salmon stocks. We've been in discussions for, particularly in my nation, is the headwaters of the Yukon River. You know, they travel over 1,000 miles just to come home to spawn, and we've had a lot of disputes with the American government on how they distribute the commercial fishing licenses, especially at the mouth of the Yukon River. So we are now feeling those effects of the commercial fishing industry. I think there's over 900 licenses on the mouth. So we are now feeling 25, 30 years. Our salmon's, you know, stocks have almost are extinct almost, and I think they're moving into that reality just based on the fact that there is now a very vivid sushi industry, let alone the pollock industry, which is on the coast where there's no interest in maintaining and protecting the salmon. So what we're noticing now in the interior is just the overharvesting of trout, which everybody loves to fish the big waters, and we have a catch and release program here, but really at the end of the day, it causes detrimental effects to the fish too. And when you're catching upwards of 60 fish a day on your fishing journey with your friends, and you know, so we're really struggling with how we deal with not only fishing, but the hunting and outfitting concessions that come and hunt the big game here, such as sheep and moose and caribou. We're feeling the effects of those too. It's just and now we have people that have been fourth generation Yukoners feel they have every right that the First Nations do. And why do they have all these rights to harvest when I'm a fourth generation Yukoner and I should have the same privilege? So.
Thank you. Rachel, did you have a question? You raised your hand and I put you in the speaker box. You just have to unmute.
No, I must have raised it by mistake.
Okay, so we'll go on to the next written question from Nancy Bird for Stephen Haycox. She's asking if you met a gentleman named Bill Smith in Old Crow. I'm summarizing, it's a long question, that he was a persistent advocate and gadfly advocating for native rights before the government of the Yukon Territory. Are you familiar with him and could say something about him?
Hi, Nancy. Nice to hear from you. No, I didn't know Bill Smith. I heard a lot about him. When I was working in Canada, I was really concentrated on British Columbia. I really would like to learn a great deal more about the history of Yukon land claims, and perhaps Grand Chief Peter Johnston, I could correspond with you about that if you would be interested. But no, Nancy, to answer your question, I had no direct contact with Bill Smith, though I think a lot of people have heard about him.
Okay, there's two questions for you, Bill. People want to know what's the solution. They'd like to hear your solution.
How much time do we have? Well, I think that it's fair to say that the citizens of Alaska deserve to speak up and vote on whether they would accept an amendment to the Alaska State Constitution, providing a provision for rural subsistence harvest in times of resource shortage. I think that given the history, I know there have been lots of attempts through the legislature, but when in 1982, it came before the voters, they were unanimously in support of rural subsistence priority at that point. And what has held it up has been, I think, a small group of influential sportsmen who have influenced particular legislators in terms of blocking the amendment process. But such a solution, I think, would allow the state to gain management of fish and game throughout the whole region. The federal government would then be in agreement with the state managing subsistence. So in a nutshell, that's my solution. Perhaps other members of the panel would like to address that.
Well, Will, I certainly would. As you well know, we went through over a decade of legislatures being petitioned to come into compliance with a rural preference as mandated in ANILCA. And over a decade of debate in the Alaska legislature came up dry, which is why we now have what we call dual management. Are you optimistic that the current legislature, which is even more conservative than the legislatures of the 1990s, which refused to deal with this, the 1980s and 90s, which refused to deal with this, would do that? And where would a constitutional amendment come from? It would have to come either through referendum from the legislature, or it would have to come by citizen initiative. How could we make that happen?
Yeah, it's a very difficult practical problem. It's an ideal solution, but it's a difficult practical problem. But without addressing it, without keeping it in the legislature's focus at some level and advocating for it, in a sense, we're promulgating this dual system, which has created conflict over the years and continues to. There's some recent cases in the news.
I interviewed a lot of people in National Park Service, and particularly members of the Federal Subsistence Board. And I've talked to a few people, not very many, I wish it would have been many more, but I've talked to a few people on the local boards. And the people that I've talked to on the local boards feel fairly confident that they are being listened to. That doesn't mean that they always get the solution that they want, but what they've said to me is that they feel that at least they have an opportunity to talk quarterly, and that they're being heard. What have you heard?
You're talking about fish and game boards?
I'm talking about the subsistence boards, the Federal Subsistence Board, and then the regional councils.
I think it's fair to say that people are very happy with the Federal Subsistence Boards.
Yeah, because it's giving them the preference they deserve.
Yeah, the issue is at the state level, with state fish and game.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
And the fish and game boards.
Yeah. Right. Thank you.
There was a question for Paul that I was going to read, and we seem to have lost him. So, Sue, let's see if he comes back on. If not, maybe we can email him your question, and maybe he can get back to you about that, which had to do with his Alaska Cool curriculum website. So there's another question for the chief. From Philip White about, he thanks you for the presentation and asks, what impact did the Native Claims Settlement Act in Alaska have on the land claims process in the Yukon? Were there clear lessons that the Alaska experience offered? And you have to unmute yourself again. Okay.
Well, I think we learned a lot from many different examples throughout the world. And I think we benefited from the fact that we took a government approach first before the commercial economic side. I think just having that ability to negotiate our rights from a place of, you know, there's so many policies and so many things that affected our life prior to that, that we needed to look at, one, our rights as traditional people to the land, but how we're going to navigate in this reality going forward in a contemporary fashion. So I think, you know, just taking examples from different places has definitely benefited us in the vision that we had with our umbrella final agreement at the end of the day. So hopefully that answers your question in a proper way, but we can definitely do a supplementary if possible.
Okay, yeah, we're sort of running out of time here, but lots of good questions. Paul is back. So Paul, there is a question for you in the written Q&A from Sue Sheriff about your AlaSchool website, that it's a primary source for students in lots of history and cultural issues, particularly ANCSA. And she sees that the site has had some updates in the last 10 years, but is wondering if you're the one who does the updating, and given the 50th anniversary of ANCSA coming up, would there be an interest in funding staff or students to assist with updating it? And that it's such a good resource that with everybody being online for education now, maybe it's a time to update it.
It's an excellent question. The AlaSchool website has been practically unfunded for really more than 5 years at this point. And it's one of those sort of perennial issues of just trying to put together a good proposal for updating it. The software for it is extremely old that underpin the AlaSchool website. I'm not a technical person, obviously, but my understanding is that the reason for the audio and the video parts are that they're no longer functioning is just from an internet standpoint, the ancient nature of the software that's underpinning the AlaSchool website. And it's one of those projects, issues that it's on a to-do list. We have meetings about it on occasion. It's never gotten around the bend to actually a funded upgrade of the materials. And they're exactly right. We do need to move forward on that because it's just gradually grinding to a halt. And it continues to receive actually more international attention than it does within Alaska in terms of hits and just email correspondence that I get from elsewhere. I think it is a valuable site, and it just needs, that baby needs some nourishment. So there's that.
Ron, did you want to ask something?
Yes, I do. About 30 years ago, I had the opportunity to interview George Rogers, who was the economist for the state, the territory. He told me a story that was pretty interesting about when the Alaska fishermen were pretty much catching all the salmon that were going up into Canada. And the Canadians were very upset about that because they weren't getting any fish to repopulate the population. When the US had jurisdiction, they wanted to do something, but the Alaska fishermen got their guns out and they were threatening anyone who tried to stop them. Well, George Rogers was sent to talk to Mr. Trudeau Sr. about this issue. They kicked it around for a long time, and they decided that they could not do anything because the population had not developed that idea of ecology and about the balance of nature. And they felt that they were fighting against the current, even though they could see the necessity of doing something. But they felt they were going against the tide. So they had to wait a long time before that became an issue that even the politicians would deal with. And I think that's maybe where we are with this dual management business. you have to sort of muck around in your own juices for a while before you realize you've had enough and there has to be a more practical solution. But you can't get too far ahead of your troops or your troops will desert you. And the kind of situation that we have with elected governments is essentially that. The people who are the ministers have inside information, they have better insight, but oftentimes they're not able to do anything because they have to be beholden to the people who elect them. So it is a matter of public education and bringing everyone around, and that's a very difficult thing to do. Thanks for these stimulating panels.
Ron, do you want to ask your written questions as well since you're on?
Yes, this was generally for Steve, and that was about the ANCSA bibliography that's being developed for the 50th anniversary. I'm curious if there are sources that you think should be added that most people don't know about, or more importantly, the place that Bill was, taking a look at the people who were in the background in Congress, who knew and guided some of that through. And I'm thinking of people like John Katz, who knew a lot of that, but we really don't have much documentation from them to be able to guide us to the documents and to the actual way that a lot of that happened congressionally.
May I get back to you by email on that, Ron? I think it's a terrific question, terrific interest. I'm very interested too, and there are a lot of people who should be interviewed. Will Schneider, you could put together a whole project on this and it would be extraordinarily valuable. Ron, may I get back to you on email with that?
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a question from Andrew Higgs to both or Chief Johnston and Steve Haycox. How were Native land rights addressed during the 1906 Alaska-Canada Boundary Tribunal?
I would defer to Grand Chief Peter Johnston on that. I do have a comment.
Okay, the rest of the questions. Generally, were there Aboriginal considerations from either side of the border concerning the effects of creating a divided line between what had traditionally been cohesive Indigenous territories?
No, there weren't. And, I think the only benefit we have really back to the homelands and is through the Jay Treaty. And that is something that allows us as First Nation people on this side of the border to be able to go across to the American side, or to the Alaskan side in this case. Traditionally we're allowed to have that ability to go back and forth. So that's really the only benefit that we have today. But outside of that, we were never consulted on anything. Even the borders within Canada that define British Columbia or Northwest Territories were never consulted with the First Nations here. We're finally getting consulted now within the last 25 years, pretty well, to put it lightly.
The same was true on the American side. That boundary was written by people sitting in Belgium who were looking at maps. There was no consultation with the native people of Alaska either. It's actually an issue that I think is ripe for some investigation as to what the evolution then was of the people on either side of that line following its implementation.
Good point.
Bill, you had something you wanted to say.
Could I just make an announcement that the Alaska Historical Society has received funding to support a documentation project of original sources for the study of ANCSA. And we will be initiating that project shortly. Thank you.
And just one last comment in the chat, and I'm sorry, Patuk, I keep interrupting. You're the moderator, but question came up for Paul, whether there's anything the Alaska Historical Society could do to help advocate for the updating of Alaskool, and if so, who might we target in terms of funding or things like that? And maybe that's a longer conversation to have later, but there is that offer being suggested.
Well, that would be a welcome move. One of the things that I think might be helpful too for more people who are looking into ANCSA, is that there's this enormous treasure of committee reports from congressional hearings in the development of ANCSA, and those still are not available online in a searchable digital format. And I've always thought that would be a wonderful addition to a law school as a set of primary documents for us to better understand the social and political context of ANCSA.
This is Patuk. We've got Harvey Kitka with his hand up. Maybe that'll be our very last question.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you. Harvey Kitka, I had one question that was basically for the historian part. Basically, I was wondering if the state of Alaska would ever consider recognizing the tribes as governments of their own. Basically, like in Canada, they're allowed to basically get into Congress and have government-to-government discussions. The state of Alaska, we have a lot of different entities that are talking for us, but we don't have a real government-to-government relationship with the state of Alaska. I believe if we could have that, then we could start moving forward at this point. Thank you.
Well, I could respond to that some, and I appreciate the question very much, Harvey. Thank you for it. And Will Schneider, you may want to weigh in on this. I wouldn't look for that to happen anytime soon, because the state of Alaska, in my view, is still very much very, very wary about what it would consider to be too much recognition of local governance that would erode their jurisdiction. I think we see that in a number of areas, and I think that the question of what that relationship would be would ultimately have to be determined by the Alaska Supreme Court. But I wouldn't even look for the legislature to go there, and I don't think any governor is going to try to go there, because they are afraid that they would lose whatever political support they have elsewhere in the state. I'm sorry, that's perhaps a very pessimistic view, but I hope it's a realistic one.
I would just add briefly that at the federal level, in terms of the Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission, that they have been able to establish a relationship with the Fish and Wildlife Service for a place at the table, and that their recommendations have to be formally recognized. And while that is not to say that they have to be acted upon in a positive way, it is to say that they have a place at the table in a way that in many other aspects of federal and state government, we don't see that degree of control. Thank you.
Well, since
Thank you very much.
we are way out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists for coming in today and speaking to the group, and I want to thank all of our attendees for being patient and listening in. Karen, did you want to add anything else?
No, just thank you guys, and thank you Patuk for moderating. Great session, and just remind everybody, 2 o'clock will be our monuments and history in the public square discussion. Sorry, we have a little bit of a shorter break today, but come back and join us this afternoon. Thanks.
Thanks to all the panelists, and thanks for the opportunity.
Karen, do you want to say who's going to be on the panel with Ian moderating?
Sorry, yeah, well, you could say it, but Aaron Leggett, Mary Erlander, and Ross Cohen will be the panelists, with Ian Hartman moderating, and then it'll be opened up for general community discussion. So hopefully everybody will be eager to participate.
All right, thank you everybody.
Thank you, Patuk.
Thank you, Patuk.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.